Oh, hey guys, this is Pecora Ryan DeBar. I'm here in Stuttgart, Germany, birthplace of the automobile, headquarters of Mercedes-Benz, Porsche. I'm not here to talk about that. I'm going to talk at you this morning about um, was Clarksburg ever a quote-unquote mafia town? You know, if you're like me, you've heard this all your life. And if you're snuffy like me, you don't really know what to make of it. I'm not of that generation um, that lived during a time when the mob was super active in Clarksburg. Um, okay, it was, but I was very young. By the time I got in my teenage years, it was a thing of the past. So I've done some reading in that, research in that over the last, I don't know, year and a half. Partially because a guy I used to work with started asking me questions. And I want to trace out a little timeline for you here. Okay, so to start things off, a simple Google search will bring up an organization in the Clarksburg, Fairmont area called the Wandering Family, or Famiglia Vagabonda. It started around 1904-ish among members of the South Italian community in the region, and they engaged in extortion, some prostitution activity, very likely drug activity, selling opium to injured people, war veterans, addicts, just typical mafia type stuff. Although they technically maybe not the mafia. The tensions in that organization started really coming to a head in the 1920s, because you had some of the leaders were from the Naples area, associated with the organization called the Pecora, and then you had that's a crime type family in the Naples area. You had your Calabrians, who are more from like the foot or the toe of Italy. Didn't always get along. The Calabrians in Clarksburg were run by a man named Sinetti, and he was a really strong man, known just tremendously strong man. He lived in the area of Reynoldsville, and Naples brothers of Clarksburg came out to him, and they said, "Hey, we got this moonshine guy gonna sell us a bunch of moonshine. Get in the car," and when he did, they blew his head off. So in retaliation for that, the Corbi brothers and a man named Vincenzo or Jim Urso killed one of the Naples brothers in Kelly Hill. He was taking some money from his barbershop to the bank, and they waxed him. Well, this really brought the hand of law enforcement down and kind of decapitated that organization. All the leaders were either dead or they had to flee. 4 men swung from the gallows. They were executed in Harrison County. And Urso fled to Canada. And the Corbi brothers, a couple of them went to prison, but they ended up in Baltimore. And in fact, they did so well in Baltimore, they ended up as the head of the Baltimore family, Mafia family. At that point, the Mafia, which were Sicilians, had begun to integrate other Italians into their organization. Baltimore was never that big of an organization, and although it's called a family, it's often just viewed as a crew of the Gambino family in New York. So the Corbis reported to the consigliere of the Gambino family up through the 1980s, when that consigliere died. He was given the opportunity, the consigliere was, to be head of the family, but he was old. He'd been to prison, and he let John Gotti have it. I want to talk to you now about a man named Joseph Pendilli, Giuseppe Pendilli. He occurs repeatedly in historical documents as being a significant figure in the Pittsburgh and Cleveland crime families. He was deported from the United States twice for drug trafficking. He was deported to Italy. He came back and was deported to Argentina. He appears to have killed a man in Grafton around 1912 for refusing to join the Black Hand organization. And then he shows up in the Fayetteville area of West Virginia where he lived, and he stole another man's wife, had a few kids by her. They lived together in a common law marriage, although they were never officially married. In the late 1920s, he shows up just north of Morgantown in Gallatin, Pennsylvania, mentoring and nurturing, bringing up a man named Antonio Ripepi, who went on to be a major boss. Very powerful figure in the Pittsburgh family. Some would see him as perhaps the most powerful figure. Ripepi married one of the Quattrone sisters. This is where it gets interesting. Jim Urso shows up again. His daughter marries one of those Quattrone sisters. And Mr. Ripepi shows up as godfather of Frank Corbi and Baltimore's child. So definitely a connection between Ripepi and the Corbis and West Virginia. The other thing about the Quattrone sisters is there's a Cosimo Quattrone in Steubenville. I haven't exactly pinned down the relationship. They appear to be first cousins or maybe uncle type relationship. And this Mr. Quattrone run gambling operations in Steubenville, which at the time were humongous. In fact, Steubenville, a lot of that operation later moved on to Las Vegas and became the kernel, the core of gambling in Las Vegas. Quattrones were also involved in the Tropicana Hotel of Vegas. I want to talk to you now about a couple guys named John Bazzano. John Bazzano Sr. shows up in the Charleston area, has been involved in Black Hand operations, a little bit south of Charleston in the coal mining communities. And then later, in the late 1920s, early 1930s, he emerges in Pittsburgh and becomes head of the Pittsburgh family. He was working closely with some brothers, Volpe brothers, but they began to move in on his turf, so he invited them into a shop or something and executed them, or had them all killed. And because of this, he was called to account by the five families in New York. They said, come here and answer for yourself. When they got here, they killed him with ice picks. Like, it was brutal, just killing. And a lot of the heads of the family, major families, were arrested for this because the cops found them celebrating his murder later that same day. But they all got let go. I think they found the fall guy. Bazzano was killed for this, but it was always rumored that Pendilli and Ripepi were also in on the killing of the Volpe brothers. You see, this was reemerging as a fight between Calabrians and crime bosses from the Naples area. That constant tension existed, not only in Clarksburg, but within the Pittsburgh organization, and possibly even within New York, because there's rumors, again, Bino is really one of the Volpe brothers killed, but then when Vito Genovese pushed it, they backed down, because Vito was kind of the biggest of the five bosses at that time. So Bazzano's dead. His son, John Bazzano Jr., is still hanging around, operating in the Pittsburgh area, and he marries Antonio Ripepi's son. Yeah, so that means this guy is tied back in to some of the earlier Clarksburg Fairmont people. Bazzano Jr. later goes on to become the boss of Pittsburgh, and he was such until 2008 when he died. Okay, so the hypothesis I'm putting forward is that the Ripepi organization, the Ripepi family of the Pittsburgh family, is the successor to the Famiglia Vagabonda of Clarksburg, Fairmont area, and West Virginia generally, including Southwest Pennsylvania, excluding Wheeling. I think I've proven that. I can continue on with this, and I will to a certain extent, but I really want to be delicate here, because as you start getting into things that happened in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, you're dealing with people who are still alive, or their children, their siblings are alive, or in some cases, there's crime figures from Fairmont in the 1920s that have descendants that have exactly the same name today, and they're young people. And I would never want to. I just don't want to be like that guy. So anyway, this Antonio Ripepi, once he got into his 50s, or into the 1950s, he was a multimillionaire already from all the stuff he was involved in. And he started investing in genuine businesses. And the incredible thing is he was employing people in his business who were first cousins, who were family members, who were from Fairmont. I think that kind of solidifies it, right? that kind of proves my hypothesis here. So as Ripepi got old in the 1960s, he retired, and his rackets were picked up by a couple people. One was the Mannarino brothers in New Kensington, Pennsylvania. Gabe Mannarino was kind of seen as a crazy one. He himself got shoved aside by the Mafia in the 1960s because he was doing some wacky stuff. Like, for example, he stole arms, like M1 rifles, from Army National Guard or Army Reserve Armory in Canton, Ohio. And he intended to sell them to rebels in the Dominican Republic. One of his accomplices in this was a truck driver from Elkins, and his wife was from Clarksburg. And they took the arms on a truck to a waiting plane. The plane was rented from a company in Clarksburg owned by Al Schroth, car dealer here in Clarksburg. And that rental company had offices on 4th Street, just across the bridge, where I think today is a small engine repair shop. I don't have any reason to think there's a connection between the current owner and the former owner. But it just gets interesting. One of the people who was suspected of having broken into the armory, who was known for theft, was a man named Paul Hankish, who had been arrested for stealing from a grocery store in Fairmont. Now, Paul Hankish becomes very significant later on because he becomes the mob boss of Wheeling. Wheeling, to that point, up until the 1960s, had been run by a Greek man named Big Bill Elias. Big Bill started running into some problems, tax problems with the IRS for hiding his gambling earnings. And this was a problem for the Pittsburgh family, for the Mannarinos, because Art Rooney, owner of the Steelers, had run the rackets in Pittsburgh area among the Irish and German population for decades. In fact, he was one of the major investors of Las Vegas also, along with the Mars in New York, with whom they are intermarried. And something needed to be done because the federal government had its thumb on that Big Bill and his organization. So they started running bets through this Paul Hankish guy instead. Things I forgot to mention is that there's a Garfia fellow who was involved in some of the planning and the organization of the theft in the Canton Armory. I think he worked a lot in the Youngstown area. And the same guy appears alongside Joseph Pendilli's name as having murdered a guy in Grafton years and years before. So I'm just layering it on here, the connections between Clarksburg and the actual mafia. Um, Getting back to Hankish, he had associates in the Clarksburg area, whom I won't name. If you know, you know. I'll just say they weren't Italian. All right. Moving on. Other rackets of Ripepi were picked up in the Weirton area, the casinos up there, by a man named Jojo Pecora. I've never been able to determine that there's any relationship between him and the people in Clarksburg by that name, so I'm not going there. Pecora went to federal prison, and remember how I said that Tropicana was founded by people related to Ripepi? Well, you know who else owned a little bit of the Tropicana? Oh, that's right, Bernard Folio. And then there's a book by a man, a lawyer out of Wheeling, a Greek man, George Sideropoulos, who describes a conversation he had with Bernard Folio, where Archmore, who, went to prison for bribery, not exactly a good guy. And from the Hankish documents, it kind of shows that he was receiving a little bit of what was going on up in Wheeling, Clarksburg areas as far as the organized crime. He was collecting his tax to have the state police turn the other cheek. Well, the feds really didn't want him being senator. So Judge Maxwell allegedly approached Bernard Folio and said, how do we get you to throw your support behind, the Democrat candidate, Jennings Randolph, instead of Archmore? And allegedly Archmore said, get Jojo Pecora out of prison. Why would he do that? Well, anyway, allegedly it worked. Maxwell commuted the sentence, or gave him a shorter sentence, or let him out on parole or something. And Jennings Randolph went on to win the election. Okay, so I'll wrap it up with this. This is probably the most unpleasant part of the conversation at this point. I don't know if you noticed, but there's a man who died last week. His obituary was posted by Davis Weaver, but was not in the newspaper. He had no service. He was cremated. Carl Lee Gallo ran the Gallo organization. You can start looking at the names of who he's related to. Whatever. He's credited with having killed Joe Schaefer Sr., or his henchmen did, and fighting over gambling rackets and other stuff in Clarksburg in the 1970s. His obituary does not mention one specific person. But if you go back to that person's name, when that person died, his half-brother is mentioned as Carl Lee Gallo. Who was it? It's a guy, last name of Urso. Remember, I go back to Vicentia Big Jim Urso, having killed Frank Sonetti of Reynoldsville, intermarried with the Ripepis and all that. Yeah, so I just leave it at that. You're getting into naming the names of people who are alive today and stuff like that. There's definitely a connection there. And I'll just say, none of us have families that are perfect. You can find some of my family members that I wouldn't be proud of. And people can be remarkably different. Children can be different than their parents, and one sibling can be different from another. And the times are different, and some of the crimes involved, wouldn't even be crimes today, like running a numbers racket, gambling. The state of West Virginia does that today. But it's an interesting part of Clarksburg's history, and I'm afraid that um, it's just going to disappear and get hidden because people are ashamed of it or embarrassed by it. I'll holler at you later.